So as I've mentioned, the plan is to have a couple of short movies per week that will complement the larger slide deck. I'm just going to give you a little bit of a primer of what we're going to talk about this week. So as I've mentioned, I've divided the course into 2 general parts covering each semester. So part 1 of this course is where we start, and it's about the basics, looking more generally at what security is, who it's for, how we explain and understand and measure it, and what are some of the primary actors to look at when we're studying security. We're also parsing out the idea of looking at security as a thing, security as a process that comes along with a set of policies, practices, and technologies, and with the academic and policy study of security, aka security studies. So in part 1, by necessity, you're going to have some preliminary introductions to some of the major theoretical approaches in security studies, such as realism, liberalism, constructivism, which I know a lot of you have covered in international relations, but this is going to be more focused on the security aspect of it. And we're going to get into them in much more detail in terms of their relevance to topics and issues in part 2. And we will have weeks devoted to examining the particular approaches. We'll also be returning to theoretical approaches to security all throughout the course as we look at specific topics and issues in security studies. So this week we're starting from scratch and having a conversation about the basic concept of security itself, its meaning within the context of security studies, and also how it is studied. We are going to discuss the ontologies of security studies, which refers to the questions of what security actually is. So ontology refers to the study of being. So what is security? We're looking at and introducing some of the main arguments and debates that animate questions in security studies. So what are the fault lines and the different ideas that are sort of competing with each other within studies of security? We're also going to foray a bit into epistemologies and methodologies. That is, what do we know about it and where does our knowledge come from? In terms of readings this week, I gave you the first chapters of the textbook as your first assigned readings, and they tackle some of these basic questions, I think, really well. And an article by David Baldwin about the relative neglect that the concept of security itself has faced by academics and policymakers alike. And an additional article written by a very well-known realist named Stephen Walt, which gives a good taste of what security studies looked like in its more traditional form right after the end of the Cold War and many years before 9/11. So your slide deck is going to pull out some of these main themes in those readings and relate them to this week's topic. So think about those connections and how they might inform our understanding of security. So one thing that is really kind of important to recognize is that if I ask you what security is, or about a time or a circumstance where you felt secure, something that discussion will highlight right away is that ideas about what security is can vary quite significantly. Nevertheless, it's one of those things that we're pretty comfortable answering. It's not hard to sort of explain when we feel secure or why we feel secure. But a lot of our answers are going to be different. Such is the nature of an essentially contested concept. So what is an essentially contested concept? It can be defined as a concept that is both vague but also commonsensical, and disputes about its nature don't by definition preclude other ways to define it. Essentially contested concepts are often abstract and qualitative notions. So one thing that I would ask you to think about is, can you think of any other concepts that might fulfill this criteria? If you want, you can pause for a few seconds and think about some of the things that you might consider to be an essentially contested concept. Okay, if you paused and now you're back, some examples would be art, justice, evil, globalization, peace, and there's lots of other examples. And if you have any other ideas, we can talk about them when we meet next. Now, the readings I gave you all split hairs about the degree to which security is an essentially contested concept, but all agreed that it was, at the very least, a contested idea, and that the concept itself is something worth defining, even if we might not all share the exact same definition. So we are going to continue to ask throughout the course, what is security and how do we define it? And the coming weeks and readings really look into these questions and try to parse out all the different ways that we can understand the concept of security.